This is a tiny patchwork slow stitched piece. I'm going to show how I made it from start to finish using scraps left over from a previous project. And I'm going to spend a lot of time showing how I stitched this little bunny. I'm using my miniature bunny template from my miniature set, and I'll show step by step how I fill in the background to make this bunny's fur come to life. And stay tuned to the end where I'll show a preview of what I'm going to do with this completed piece. Let's get started. I have this tiny piece of scrap felt. It's only about 2 3/4 inches tall and 4 inches long. It's very small. And so I've made this little collage with some scrap fabrics. These are all cottons, and they're a bit heavier. They're quilting cottons. They're pieces that are left over from this pouch that I made recently, and I used this minty fabric and some of this red, and I really liked the way that the colors played off of each other. So I took what was left from making this pouch and I used the pieces for this mini collage. This is a bag that I showed in a recent members only video where I shared an update of the things I'm working on. Members have access to see what's happening behind the scenes, projects I'm working on, and have a chance to have input on future videos. If you're interested in becoming a member, you can click on the link below and see if it's something you want to do. Now back to the project. So the first thing I'm going to do now that I've made my fabric collage is I'm going to baste everything in place. I'm going to use sewing thread for that. I'm going to take big stitches on the back and small stitches on the front. When I start my basting, I like to tie a knot on the end of my thread just so it doesn't pull out while I'm stitching. And I'm going to carefully hold everything in place while I come through with these small stitches and hop from piece to piece. This was a piece of thread that was left from the last time I basted, so we'll see how far I can get. It's about as far as I can take this. So I'm going to pull it to the back. So now I've basted this in place. I'm going to come in with some embroidery floss and stitch these pieces down a bit more. I have this red that's a nice match for the reds, and this color's a bit darker than this green, but a fairly good match for this one. So I'm going to use these two colors to start and get these pieces stitched down. I'm going around the edges of all these pieces of fabric. I went across here and I've come down here. I want to point out that my stitches aren't straight. They aren't the same length, and I think that adds charm to it. I've had some questions about my stitches and whether I worry about them being the same length or looking even, and I really don't. I think that it adds a real authenticity, and it shows that someone made it, and it's very in line with looking like a handmade thing, a hand-stitched thing, folk art. So I'm not worrying about that as I go along. This is only the first layer of stitching. And while it's going to show at the end, it's not the highlight, it's not the only thing. So I'm going to continue going around all these pieces. I've decided I'm going to do that with this same color. So I've gone around all the pieces and everything's stitched down. So the first thing I want to do is take out my basting stitches. Because I used black, I can see them really well, and they're a little distracting, and I don't need them at all. So out they come. If I need to, I cut these, and in cases like this, I didn't have to. So this piece, I actually reuse them. I put it together with that needle and the thread, and I use them a few times before they wear out. So here's my piece, and I'm looking at it, and I'm going to bring out my little miniature template set. I'm wondering if my little bunny would fit right here. I like that. I could trace this onto a piece of freezer paper and then iron that onto a piece of fabric and cut that out. It would be really hard to do. I would use embroidery scissors and cut it out, but it's very, very small. So that would be one option. And the other option is to put it where I want it and to trace it with an erasable pen. So I have a couple of these. This is the 0.7 size, so it's thicker. And I have this in a few colors. And then I have this one, which is a 0.5. So the tip of it is quite a bit smaller. So I think I'm going to use that because I've got a couple of areas here where it's very, very small. And I think it's going to be a little easier to use this finer tip. I'm doing more of a sort of making dots motion than tracing straight because I don't want to pull the fabric or pull any stitches that exist. So now this part of the fabric, there's one solid piece, so I can gently trace it, but most of it, it's going to work better to just make dots. And that's going to give me the rough outline of these tiny little areas. I pull that away and have a look at it. And my outlines are pretty good there. Let's see this little part where the ear is. Make a few more dots, so that's really clear. This is going to erase with heat. And the thing that I can notice here is because I've traced it that, you know, this ear is thicker than the template. The face, everything's thicker. So what I can do is keep that in mind. It still looks like a bunny, and so I could just do stitching right over top of these lines. But also what I can do is stitch just inside these lines for a tiny bit more precision. Either one will work in this case. For the bunny, I'm choosing a brown, this brown here. There's a little bit of brown in the fabric. The stem here is brown, and the stem here. And so instead of choosing black or something for an outline, I thought brown would be good. So I'm going to stitch inside the lines. So one thing that's good to do when you're stitching a small area, I find, is I like to come in away from it with my knot, just so there isn't too much bulk, because I know I'm going to be adding a lot of stitching. So my knot's kind of above here. Then I can come in and stitch. And that way, when I come back in with all the stitching that I could potentially do, I know that I'm not going to have to contend with stitching over top of knots on the back. So I'm doing a kind of back stitch where I am going past and coming back. So going past the previous line of stitching, going past it and coming back and going into it. So I'm stitching this in real time, but you may want to use the slow motion feature that YouTube has to get a really in-depth look at what I'm doing. And I'm just inside my ink lines here. I'm using 2 strands of embroidery floss. That's what I normally use, so that's kind of a standard. That's, you know, really 1 would be okay. 3 would be a bit of a thicker line, but I find for the stitching I do that 2 strands is kind of always a nice thickness. Sometimes with these mini templates, it might make sense to use 1 strand going into a really small, tiny spot. And I think I did that. If you've seen my video where I make the scroll using all of my mini templates, using almost the entire set of mini templates. I think the only one I didn't use was the cat in that one. There were some animals I stitched where I decided to use one strand for a portion of it. It's because it was so small. So that may make sense to do in some cases. So when I use one strand, I use a thinner needle, and you're really able to get some really, really delicate lines. Today I'm using 2 strands, and I think it's a nice thickness for the outline of this bunny, and I'm going to continue to use 2. You can see sometimes when I make a stitch, it pulls straight when you're going around a curve. So I can fix that. In my next stitch, I can kind of pull that previous stitch and go in just past where I had come out. And that helps to create the shape that I want. I take my needle and I pull, and then I go in. This is a little tail, little puffball tail. So I could skip right past it and continue imagining the outline of the last of the rounded bit of the bunny here, and then leaving that out. So that's an option. And completely leaving it out and coming back in with whatever color you decide you want to make it. Like that. And I think in this case, I'm going to add it. This is a really tight curve of the tail, and I think I will, in the end, most likely be using a light color to make the tail. So this stitching may be completely covered up, or there might be some of this brown that shows through. But I think I want to add it here because as soon as I'm finished stitching this, I want to bring the heat onto this piece and erase these ink lines. So I think it's good to have this little outline completed. Of course, I could retrace it on afterwards, or I could even just eyeball this little circular tail area. Those are all options. I'm just going to continue stitching the rest of this little bunny. So I've stitched all the way around this bunny, and I'm going to bring the heat over and erase it. One thing I think that's going to be clear, at least to me right away, is how imperfect it is. And that's often true at the very beginning, but it's going to be filled in with stitches. I can use stitches to make up for any areas where it's not looking quite right. So to me, when I look at this little bunny and my stitching, I think the ears look a little funny. So when I come in with whatever color I decide, I want to fix the ears a little bit. I think they need a little bit more of a shape to make them look like they're coming out of this nice round head of the bunny, and that's not clear yet. I may want to shape the chest a little bit more, and I may want to define this back leg and the front leg more. So don't be discouraged if you're using especially a small template and you take the time to stitch it and it doesn't look completely great. It's all fixable. It could also be that you look at it and think it's not great, but somebody else wouldn't even notice. So for me, I can notice some imperfections, and when I say imperfections, I don't mean I need it to be perfect, but I want it to really look like a bunny. And to me, it's bunny-ish, but I want it to be a little bit more like a bunny. And my biggest area where I notice that is up here. So that's all going to come through in the stitching that I do. So I pulled out two colors in trying to decide what color I want the bunny to be. One is this paler brown color, and the other is this gray color. So I'm looking at the gray that's here in this little stump. So that's an option. And here's the brown. So the pale brown is closer to the color at the top of the stump here. The stump's a little bit more yellow than this color, but I'm liking this color more. What I'm thinking about is this gray color is very pale, and this shape here is a large shape on such a small piece, and it's very, very light. So to have another one right beside it might not be as interesting to look at or as much of a contrast. But if this color is here, it's going to pick up on these yellow tones that are here in the top of this little stump, and that might add a little more interest and movement in the piece. So I'm going to start by coming in with this lighter color, and I can move to a darker shade if I want it to be a little darker. I want to add some areas of darkness. This is a good place to start. I have 2 strands of this floss I'm going to start with. And if I need to, I'm going to come back with a 1 strand. It may be necessary to fill in some of these smaller areas. I'm going to start at the ear. This is a place where I want to really adjust the shape. I think I'm going to want to come in on this lower ear and add some pink for the inside of the ear. So I'm going to leave some space right in the middle of the ear. And my strategy here is just to continue to take small stitches, just like I'm drawing with a pencil or coloring in with a colored pencil, and fill in this ear. Some of the outline, the darker brown, may get covered up. I'm not worrying about that, because this is an area where I'm trying to reestablish a shape. I'm already liking the way that that ear is changed shape with just these few stitches. The only thing to really keep in mind in my book is to pay attention to the direction that the stitches go, because those lines will show. It's similar to the way if you colored something in, that there is a visible part in terms of direction that shows. I'm going to show the other bunny I stitched in my scroll project to show what I mean about the direction of your stitches. So here's my bunny. This one's facing in the opposite direction, and I ended up stitching this bunny. He's a little bit plumper than this one, but it's the same template that I used. So for this bunny, the stitches are all following the direction that the fur would go as much as possible. Around the face, they're kind of following, going towards the ear, and then downward here and sort of a round on the round part. So that's the strategy I'm going to use here. I used a different color to outline. It's a lighter brown, and then I came back with 1 strand of black, sort of outline it further. So you can always add more highlights or lowlights. That's a tiny French knot for an eye, and I added pink in the ear and a tiny little pink stitch for a nose. So I may do something similar in this piece. I'm just going to work my way through. This is 2 strands of floss in all of this stitching, except for the black. The outline of the black that I put in afterwards is 1 strand, but my initial outline of this sort of medium brown color was in 2 strands. So that's what I'm going to aim for here and see how it develops. So I filled in the ears. I've left a space there to put some color in if I decide to. And now I'm going to define the shape of the face. I'm going to have my stitches going all down towards the nose, and I'm going to keep in mind the little head here. So I'm going to just kind of stitch the head in this direction, and then when I'm coming under where the roundness of the little bunny's head would be, to try and make my stitches a little rounded, but always facing towards the nose. I'm not going to leave myself a space for the eye right now. I'm going to come in after I have some of this area filled in, decide exactly where I want my eye to be, and then add my little French knot. It's also really helpful if you can't see a picture in your head of what your animal looks like or the direction of its fur or feathers, is just pull up a picture, get a good example that shows you that detail, and not to copy that picture, but just to help inform your brain about the direction of the fur, the way it moves, any lights or shadows, and just to give yourself a bit of idea where you're going. So I filled in a lot of the area in the head. Still have a bit of floss left. So at this point I want to put in my eye. So I've got some black thread, and I'm going to secure it outside of the area where I want to stitch, so that knot's not going to be in the way. And then I'll be able to come back in here and decide where I want my eye to be, and do a French knot. This is so small that I think I'm only going to wrap it twice instead of more than that, to make a small, very small knot. And go in just over top of the stitches that I have. And that might even end up being bigger eye than I wanted, but no, that's nice. So there's my eye. I've left a spot here for the nose and the ear. I may or may not make them pink. I could make them a peachy tone too. That might go with this color over here if it's more of a peachy pink than a pink pink. In this rabbit that I've done, it's a very pinky pink, and I think here I don't want to have it quite as pink. So I'm going to take my thread, my black thread, back out to the side here and knot off, just to reduce the bulk. So I can take a couple more stitches with the floss I have left on the needle here, and then I will knot off, thread up again, and keep filling in my bunny. I brought out this really pale terracotta color that I think will be a good match with the other colors. And I'm going to use that terracotta color to make a little nose and do the inside of the one ear. So I took a couple stitches in the ear. It's very, very subtle. Don't want it to be as noticeable as in my other bunny. And I've also taken those two stitches, and there's some area where I'm going to come back in and add the brown. I don't want to make the nose any bigger than that. So I'm going to finish with this floss, and then I'm going to do some stitching in the background and come back and do some more stitching on the bunny. So I haven't done any stitching on the edges, so that's still all loose. So I want to secure that down, and I'm going to come in with red. I'm I'm going to do a blanket stitch. I can really start anywhere. I'm going to start over on this corner where the teal is, and I'm going to space the stitches out, and I'm not going to measure to make them equal. I'm just going to eyeball it and try and make even stitches. And I'm going to go around all the edges. So that's going to secure all the edges, and it's also going to add some nice color and tie things together. And it'll give me ideas about where to go from there. So I've just tied off my thread. I've gone from here all the way to here, and I'm liking what that's adding. So I'm going to thread up again and continue and bring the stitching all the way around to where I started. Adding that red stitching around the edges has really added something to the piece. I'm really liking the way it's making everything pop, and it's tying together all these little pieces of patchwork. So I've moved back to working on the bunny, and I've brought some stitching down, and I've created this round shape here with stitching. I'm thinking about this leg of the bunny and this big hip that has this round shape, and so I added this to help inform the direction that my stitches are going to take. So the stitches that are here, more in the belly area, I can let them go in a sort of up and down direction. And then when I come around to this back leg, I'm going to move them in a circular direction. This is something, especially because it's in one color, this is something that's very subtle. But it's going to add to the feel of the fur, and it's going to really help give the effect of this brown bunny if all of the stitches are roughly in the direction that they would be on the bunny. So I'm going to work now and keep on stitching. I'm going to need to thread up probably a couple more times to fill this entire area. And I'm just going to keep doing what I have done, taking these small stitches and paying attention to the direction that I'm going. So I filled in the rest of the bunny with stitching. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so you can see the direction that the stitches take. It's a very slight thing, but it really adds a lot to giving the hint of fur. And in the ears, adding those stitches has really helped to correct the things that I saw as not quite right. It's just a very slight difference. And I'm fairly happy with where it's at. So I still need to add the little puffball tail. I think the gray color that I had pulled out as a possibility for a color of the bunny, I'm going to use for the tail. So that gray is very, very close to the gray in this little stump. So I'm going to use one strand. This is the first time I've used the one strand in this piece, and this is for the tail. So I'm going to come up with my knot just beside the tail. And then I'm going to come in, I'm going to fill in this circle. So the first thing I'm doing is going straight across the circle from one side to the other, crisscrossing the stitches on top of each other. So there we go, just some crisscross stitching to make a little tail for the bunny. So now I'm going to come in with this same teal color. I'm going to stitch around in the background, so it's going to be like a tone-on-tone thing to add some texture. So the stitch I'm going to be using for this, I call the wandering stitch, and they're just straight stitches. And I call it the wandering stitch because I move around the piece. I take stitches in different orientations, and they're just straight stitches. So I'm making marks, and in this case, because the color is not a contrasting color, really what I'm doing is I'm adding some texture. All my stitches are going in different directions and they're different lengths. So I turn my work as I wander around. And I'm just going to fill in all these areas with these stitches. So I've added stitches in the background in the area, this minty green teal color. And I've chosen a really light gray color that's almost white. I thought that would be nice to add stitches here and some here. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did here with the wandering stitch to complete the background stitching. So here's my tone on tone background stitching. I've added gray around this stump, and I've taken the same gray, made a few stitches in the background of this red and this teal. So this piece is now complete. A question I get asked all the time is, what do you do with these pieces? And often I take my completed pieces and I mount them on canvas. And I show how to do that in a few different videos of mine. So you can check those out if you want to mount your stitch piece on canvas. I also have another video where I show different ways that you can prepare your piece for hanging and display. This piece, I'm going to do something different with it. And that's going to be the topic of my next video. This tiny patchwork is going to be part of my jean jacket project, where I'm doing patchwork and visible mending on my favorite jean jacket that I've had for many, many years. So I hope to see you there in my next video where I show what I do with this completed bunny. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, happy stitching.